Greetings, class. This is lecture 7 on the book of Nahum. This is our last lecture before the midterm exam. Hope you guys have already downloaded the study guide for the midterm and begun the process of studying. But if you haven't, then you certainly need to do so after you finish your work on Nahum this week. Go back and study. The exam will cover all of the books that we've covered so far, Hosea through Nahum. So you want to go back and review class notes, rewatch lectures if you want to do that. But the exam will be next week, October 22nd through the 28th, I believe that is. It will be due by that Sunday night. I encourage you not to wait to the last minute just in case something happens. I know hopefully you've all read the announcement that I posted, but want to get that done as early in the week as possible. Attempt to do that in as early a time frame as you can, so that in case anything happens, we have time to work through that. So we'll just cover through the book of Nahum. I'm done trying to say that I'm going to be brief, but hopefully this week we can, in fact, hold to that and be a little more brief with our lecture. We generally accept that Nahum is the author of the book by his name. Not a whole lot of debate about that among conservative scholars. Certainly some of our more liberal friends will debate us on that, but generally conservative scholarship holds to Nahum as the author. Nahum's name means consolation, and we can certainly see how Nahum is providing consolation to the people of Judah. He's pointing the finger at Assyria and letting them know, essentially telling them that their time is coming. Their destruction is imminent, not just their pilfering of Israel and of Judah, but eventually they're going to get theirs too. Nahum 1:1 tells us that Nahum was an Elkoshite, so he's from Elkosh, but we don't really know where Elkosh was. Your class notes give you a number of suggested possibilities for where Elkosh might have been. The evidence certainly points toward Nahum as being from Judah. The evidence in the text lets us know that he's from Judah. At this time, Israel is already captive, and so we presume that he is born and raised in Judah, potentially. So that would certainly give some credence to the fourth possibility, which is that Elkosh is this village of Ecclesay between Jerusalem and Gaza. But certainly any of those other possibilities could work if you say that Nahum was born in the northern kingdom and then migrated to the southern kingdom of Judah. There are several suggestions with regard to dating the book of Nahum. It's not really clear. The book itself doesn't give us a whole lot of details about Nahum's prophetic ministry, when it might have occurred, but we can certainly gather some things just based on the text. The first suggestion that I want to just kind of briefly gloss over, because it's one that most conservatives deny, is the suggestion that the book was written after the fall of Assyria in 612 BC, is when Assyria fell. This view really denies the nature of predictive prophecy, essentially saying that the book is written as a historical retelling that is meant to look like predictive prophecy. And so this is what our more liberal friends who deny predictive prophecy will say, that it couldn't have been predictive, it had to have been a historical retelling. And so they would say that it takes place, that it was written sometime after 612 BC. We kind of just gloss over that. I think that's, well, I don't think that's a great suggestion. There are, however, a number of different dates among conservatives as well, and a variety of factors that contribute to some general disagreement in the dating. We have Nahum's reference to the destruction of the Egyptian city of Thebes in chapter 3. I believe it's 3:8, if I'm not mistaken. And and the city is actually, it's called No Ammon in the Hebrew text, which is the city of Ammon, probably referring to the Egyptian deity Amun-Ra. But this kind of gives us indication that the book was probably written after Egypt is conquered by Assyria, after Thebes falls, roughly 663 to 661 BC is when Thebes fell to the armies of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. So in light of that, we have a lot of conservative scholars that are arguing for a date around 650 BC. However, there have been some potential problems pointed out with a 650 date, particularly if we examine exactly what's going on in Judah at the time. 650 is right in the middle of the reign of Manasseh, and we know Manasseh was the most wicked king to ever sit upon the throne of Judah. And so during this time, there seems like there wouldn't be any real call for consolation in Judah. It could very well be said that the reign of Manasseh is what ultimately brought God's judgment of inescapable doom upon Judah. And so it seems like the call to consolation just wouldn't mesh well with the wicked king Manasseh. So this has led a lot of scholars to conclude that the book of Nahum was written earlier, probably sometime during the reign of Hezekiah, which is when we have the really big push of Assyria into Israel and then on further into Judah. And we talked last week, I believe, about all of the different skirmishes and the offensives that Assyria was making in Judah at this time. And so a lot of people see this as the setting for the book of Nahum, sometime around 710 to 700 BC. As further argument for this date of 710, roughly, we'll call it, we see this is really at the height of Assyrian power and dominance. When Assyria attacks and captures Israel and then continues attacking Judah, this is really right at the height of Assyrian dominance. And so certainly there would have been need for consolation in Judah during this time. By the time we get to 650 BC, Assyria's power has really started to wane, and they're becoming less and less of a threat in the region. And so this is kind of what a lot of people hang their hat on when they look to a date of about 710 to 700, late 8th century BC. However, the thing I think we need to keep in mind is that regardless of how much their influence was dwindling in the region at this time, Assyria is still very much a threat to Judah in 650 BC, really on until about 626 BC when Ashurbanipal dies. We've talked about this before. When Ashurbanipal died in 626 is when we see a succession of kings that are really weak and really failures essentially in Assyria, and ultimately this leads to Assyria's downfall. So 626 is really the date when Assyria really kind of drops off the map, if you want to put it that way. While it's true that Manasseh's reign in Judah probably ushered in this inevitable judgment of God on the nation, there's still a need for the people to be consoled because Assyria is still very much a threat and still very much poses a threat of destruction for Judah and other regions around them, really. So there's still very much this need for consolation, even if we do have a wicked king, and even if God is going to judge Judah because of the reign of Manasseh. There's still very much this need for some type of consolation in Judah. And so when we couple these possibilities with the, I think, very clear evidence from the text that Thebes has already been destroyed, and we know, like I said, we said that happened around 663, 661 BC. And when we couple that with the other possibilities here, it certainly seems that a date of around 650 is probably the most likely date for the authorship of Nahum. And so that's kind of what I'm going to stick with. That's kind of where your class notes come down. 650 is a pretty good date for the book of Nahum. Real quickly, I want to just discuss the theme of Nahum. Nahum really is all about God's judgment, namely in the destruction of Nineveh. Chapters 2 and 4 give us, 2 and 3 give us 4 distinct descriptions of Nineveh's destruction. And so this really is the primary thrust of the book of Nahum, that Nineveh is going down. Nineveh is doomed. Interestingly enough, even though Nahum never specifically mentions the day of the Lord, he doesn't use that phrase, the text shares a lot in common with many of what we call the classic Day of the Lord texts. We see war language, and that's not something that's necessarily unusual in a passage like this, and it's certainly something that we would expect to find here. But we also have a number of lines and phrases found in Nahum that are only found elsewhere in the Day of the Lord text. That's the only other place that we find those phrases and those images. I'll give you one example. Nahum 1:10 says, the last part says, they will be consumed like dry stubble. And if you look at Joel 2:5, Obadiah 18, Malachi 4:1 in your English Bible, which is actually 3:19 in the Hebrew, we see this same imagery, this image of consuming this stubble, whether it's by fire or what have you. It is this idea of being stubble being consumed. We also see imagery that is similar to Day of the Lord texts in Nahum 2, specifically verses 4, 8, 10, and 11, and then again in Nahum 3:2. So we have a lot of these lines, a lot of these phrases and images that are specifically Day of the Lord images. And even though Nahum doesn't use the phrase Day of the Lord, he uses a lot of the same images. And so if we follow the assessment of R.H. Charles, when he stated that the Day of the Lord is essentially the day on which Yahweh manifests himself in victory over his foes, if we follow that, then certainly we could argue that Nahum is giving us yet another glimpse into the Day of the Lord, even without specifically mentioning the Yom Adonai, as we would say it in Hebrew, the Day of the Lord. It's a day of judgment in which God punishes the guilty, but it's also a day of victory in which God asserts his kingship and his lordship over all creation. And so God has used Assyria as his instrument of divine punishment against Israel, but that certainly didn't mean that Assyria was going to escape judgment, that they were going to get off light. Indeed, God still judges those wicked and evil nations that he uses as instruments of his divine punishment. He doesn't let them off just because he used them. He still judges them. And so the Day of the Lord is certainly not a day for these surrounding nations to look forward to or anticipate any more than Israel and Judah should. Those nations, Assyria, Babylon eventually, Edom, as we saw with Obadiah, those nations are going to be judged just like Israel and Judah. The only difference, however, is that God is going to reestablish Israel and Judah. Eventually he's going to restore them, whereas those other nations, Assyria, nobody knows anything of Assyria anymore after 400, 300 BC. When you have Alexander the Great, who is leading wars, and they're fighting in what used to be Nineveh, and nobody even knew that it was Nineveh. They uncovered some ruins and had no idea what it was, because nobody knows. Assyria has dropped off the map, but God restores Israel and Judah. And so the theme of Nahum is certainly God's punishment and judgment of wicked nations, but more specifically, Nahum is centered on Nineveh's doom. And judgment against Nineveh is the specific theme. And so I want you to pay very close attention to that. The the specific theme of Nahum is Nineveh's doom. So it'd be important to know, were it on a quiz or a midterm exam. The last thing I want to do with you guys is discuss intertextuality, and I know that's a phrase that may be new to each of you, but I wanted to just give you an introduction, because Nahum does some great things with intertextuality, and if you've read the paper that I posted on Blackboard for this week, then you've had some introduction to intertextuality, and we're going to talk a little bit more about intertextuality when we get to the book of Zephaniah. But I wanted to go ahead and give you some introduction, because I think this is one of the coolest things about the book of Nahum, personally. And so I want you guys to be able to experience my joy in looking at this. One of the things that our minor prophets do, and indeed we see this in the Old Testament as a whole, is using other texts, using text from earlier source material to do a number of things, to drive home a point, to recontextualize an earlier text for whatever reason, to make a point. Or, as we see in Nahum, to point to Yahweh God as the one true God. And Nahum does a lot of this, and I think it's, like I said, I just think it's really cool. And so if you've read the paper that I posted, then you've already encountered some of these ideas. And so I just want to kind of briefly walk you through some of the allusions that Nahum uses to sources really outside of Scripture. We see a lot of usage of earlier biblical texts. Ezekiel comes to mind, using a lot of Deuteronomy. Jeremiah uses an awful lot of Hosea. We see this. Amos, we talked about this with Amos. Amos uses a lot of Pentateuchal phrases and imagery. And so we see this a lot in the Old Testament, but Nahum does a lot with sources outside of Scripture, which I think is really cool. And I want us to see this, because I really think that it's amazing how Nahum took some of these images and ideas from pagan cultures and really reappropriated them in order to emphasize the kingship and lordship of Yahweh God. Now, one of the main contentions that God and the prophets had with the people of Israel and Judah was their acceptance of Baal worship, the Canaanite deity Baal. They worshipped him, and they refused to turn away from this Baal worship. Now, I don't know how much you guys have done in biblical backgrounds or whatever, but Baal is the head of the Canaanite pantheon. He's the storm god. He's the controller of water and wind and war. The three W's, WWW. So he's often pictured as riding upon the clouds, which is a really unique image. But Nahum comes along and he subsumes this same rider of the clouds imagery. If you look at, go ahead and get your Bibles out. Pause the video if you need to. Get your Bible and look at Nahum 1:3, and Nahum really reappropriates this image when he stated, he says that God's way is with the whirlwind and the storm, and the cloud is the dust of his feet. And so it's God, not Baal, who was the one in control of the wind and the weather. God is the one who's riding on the clouds. And then in the very next verse, Nahum draws upon the imagery of Baal as the one who controls the waters. In 1:4, we see Yahweh God here is the one that's rebuking the sea and drying up the rivers. Now, certainly this would have served multiple purposes for the people of Judah who were hearing this. It would have drawn upon this Baal imagery, Baal as the one who is in control of the sea, the one who's in control of the water. And if you read the paper, it gives you a little bit of background about how Baal came to be in control of the sea. But it takes this imagery and it reappropriates it for Yahweh God. But it also would have called to mind the image of the parting of the Red Sea, the drying up of the rivers here is the parting of the Red Sea for the Exodus generation. And so in drawing upon this imagery, Nahum is not only reminding the people of Judah that Yahweh, not Baal, is the one who's in control of nature now, but he's the one who's been in control of nature from the get-go. He was the one who was in control for the Exodus generation. He was the one that parted the Red Sea. And so I think this is just a really cool way of Nahum coming along and saying, you guys are all worshiping Baal. You guys are all worshiping this God who you say is in control of the wind and the weather and in control of the waters. And yet look at what Yahweh God has done. He is the one that speaks to the sea and parts it. He is the one that dries up the rivers. Think of crossing the Jordan as the Israelites are coming into Canaan. The conquest, and they cross the Jordan. God is the one, Yahweh God is the one who is in control of the wind and the waters, the weather. And so I thought this was a really, really cool image that I wanted to share with you. But I think one of the most notable things that Nahum does is taking Assyrian imagery and themes and motifs and really using them in a rhetorical and ironic fashion. He doesn't just use Canaanite mythology, but he uses Assyrian imagery, Assyrian motifs, and one in particular is the lion motif, and we see this in the book of Nahum in chapter 2. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But this is the motif, the lion motif, we'll call it, is a fairly common motif throughout the ancient Near East. We have lots of kings and rulers who are regularly referred to in the annals of foreign lands by way of lion imagery. Victorious kings often boasted that they were like mighty lions. We have records of Egyptian, Babylonian, and Assyrian kings participating in regular lion hunts as a sign of their virility and a sign that they were the man. You know, they were dominant. And even though we have this in lots of other ancient Near Eastern cultures, it's found most frequently in Assyrian literature and artwork. And most notably, which I think is really cool, the motif of the royal lion hunt, which we'll see in Nahum 2, is occurring most frequently in the royal annals and palace art of Ashurbanipal. Now, Ashurbanipal is the king of Assyria during the time of Nahum's prophetic ministry. And so Ashurbanipal is the one who is taking part in more lion hunts than anyone, perhaps. Whether or not that's true, but it certainly was recorded most frequently in his his palace annals, his artwork, this motif of the royal lion hunt. And so when we look at Nahum 2, particularly verses 12 through 14, we can see how Nahum kind of takes this imagery of the royal lion hunt. We've got two oracles in particular here. Nahum 2, 12 through 13 is the first, and then 2:14 is the second. It says, "Where is the lion's cave, and the pasture for the young lions, which the lion and lionesses go there, and the lion cubs without fear? The lion tearing prey enough for his cubs, and strangling for his lioness. He filled his den with prey, and his dwelling place with torn flesh. Behold, I am against you, is the utterance of the Lord of hosts. And I will burn her chariot with smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. And I will cut off your prey from the land, and the voice of your messenger will be heard no longer." And so when we look at these two oracles, remember it's two distinct oracles. We look at the first, verses 12 through 13, we see this portrait of a lion. The lion in his cave, and he's got his prey, and he's torn it to pieces for his young cubs to devour, and he's providing for his lioness. Now, we all know that lionesses are actually the ones that hunt, but you get the image here. Assyria is that lion. This is the way that they've always portrayed themselves. They are the dominant species. They are indomitable, if you want to use that word. They're the ones who are king of the jungle. And so they are the mighty lion. And then we have this second image, this second oracle, where Nahum comes on and he presents the lion hunter. And guess what? Assyria is not the lion hunter. Assyria is the lion, and Yahweh God is the lion hunter. He is the one who is seeking to destroy the lion that is Assyria. And so we see how Nahum is taking this motif of the lion and the lion hunter, and he's just flipping it on his head. He says, okay, Assyria, you want to be the lion? Guess what? Yahweh God is the lion hunter. He is the one that is coming to destroy you. And so we see how Nahum takes these motifs and these images that are just patently Assyrian. And there are a number of others that I mentioned in that paper, and I encourage you, if you don't read anything else in that paper, at least download and read that first chapter on Nahum, because there's just a lot of things that would take me way too long to talk about here in a single lecture. But you've got conquest metaphors and treaty curses that are very specific to Assyrian kings. And Nahum comes along and he takes all of these. He takes all of these Assyrian images. He takes pagan mythology and he reappropriates it for Yahweh God. And he speaks and he writes in this real ironic tone. And he takes these prior traditions, as biblical prophets are prone to do, yet he's taking traditions that are not biblical, they're not even Israelite traditions, and he's turning them on its head. He's turning these traditions upside down to show that it's not the Assyrians that are the indomitable ones. It's not the ones who see themselves as mighty and unconquerable as the Assyrians saw themselves. They were not the ones who were really in control. In fact, they were minuscule in comparison to Yahweh God, and they were easily dominated and controlled by Yahweh God. And so I think that that's just really cool how Nahum does that. And I don't want you. A lot of times people get scared by thinking that the prophets employed non-biblical imagery, or that they used pagan mythology or other ancient Near Eastern images. And And I think the way I look at it is that it's really kind of cool, because they're taking these things that are not biblical. They're not even Israelite, and he's taking them and showing how false and misguided these other nations are in worshiping false gods and in clinging to a false sense of security, because really it's Yahweh God who's in control. It's Yahweh God who provides security. He is the one who is the creator of all things. He's the one that controls all things. And so I think that it's kind of cool how the biblical prophets took these images and these myths, if you will, from other cultures and really reappropriated them. They recontextualized them, and we'll see this when we get to the book of Habakkuk in a couple of weeks. Habakkuk does a really cool thing in Habakkuk 3. I hope we get a chance to discuss that in depth a little bit. But I don't think it's something to be scared of. I think we can firmly, confidently say that there is extra biblical material being used by the prophets, because they're using it for the specific purposes of showing that Yahweh God is the one that's in control. He is the one that is the ruler of all nations. He's the one that brought everything into being. And so they're kind of taking these images and recontextualizing them. Really, in some cases, as with here, they're turning them upside down. So I don't want us to be afraid of that. I don't want us to shy away from that. And I hope that you guys won't as we go through the rest of this semester. Again, be studying for your midterm exam. It will be here next week, and if you're not studying, it'll sneak up on you. So I want you guys to be prepared for that. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, feel free to contact me, call me, text message me, email me, whatever. I'll be glad to answer those, help you out in any way I can. Hope you guys have a good week. God bless. Shalom.